All right, so today in our video notes, we're going to be talking about evolution, but we're going to define evolution by natural selection. So first of all, we need to define evolution and natural selection. So in your packet on page 4, you have 2 vocabulary boxes, and we're first going to start with evolution. So you're going to fill out the sides of these boxes. All right, so when you look at the definition of evolution, a simple definition is it's a process by which organisms have changed over time. But I want you to add and be a little bit more specific with this change. It's actually changing over time, meaning or through something called descent with modification. So write down your definitions: the process by which organisms have changed over time through descent with modification. And we're going to kind of dive into what that means, descent with modification, as we go along with evolution. So just to remind you that biology is not just simply change over time. It's not like all of a sudden there are leaves and then there's no leaves. All of a sudden there's a little bit of rock and now there's not very much rock. It's not just a single straight line. It's a lot more complex and a lot more things happening. And so the idea of evolution kind of looks more like a branch if you look at this picture. And this idea that all life has shared some common ancestry. So it's similar with if you look at a family tree. There is some sort of commonality between these insects, and then they diverge off of certain parts of time where they have changed. And so that's kind of how we look at evolution. It's not a straight line. There's a lot more branches and a lot more complex things happening with it. So there are 2 types of evolution. So now we're on the top right corner of your definition of evolution. The first one's called gradualism, and that's a slow change of evolution, something that's happening over a long period of time from one species becoming another species. So just look at the evolution of a horse. 55 million years ago, this is some fossil evidence showing what the horses might have looked like 55 million years ago. Here is 5 million years ago, fossil evidence that we have collected from bones of horses. And then this is what 2 million years ago the horse looked like. So you can see just based off of the skeletons and their feet, just how different they have changed. But that's a long period of time. 55 million years ago is a long period of time to show this organism's changing over time. Punctuated equilibrium is the second type of evolution, and this is rapid changes that you can see in species. And most of the time, punctuated equilibrium happens because of a mutation in a gene where you're able to pass down that mutation, and that is a different new variation that might be successful. And the main example of punctuated equilibrium that we have seen is bacteria. Bacteria have recently, because we've been using antibiotics to kill bacteria, have developed some random mutations, and they're surviving and they're thriving. And then we're not able to kill some strands of bacteria with antibiotics anymore because they've mutated so quickly, they have changed how they are. And so that's an example of punctuated equilibrium. All right, so here's an example of gradualism, how it's a long period of time, and punctuated equilibrium kind of looks like that as a visual if you wanted to draw that as well. So why only certain individuals survive? Well, here is the bottom left of your evolution definition, and that is, first of all, traits vary among populations. And where did these traits come from? They come from DNA, remember. And so they have to be passed down, they have to be inheritable. So the traits that are more advantageous, the more they will be able to survive and reproduce. So that is why certain individuals may be likely to survive, because they have a trait that provides them an advantage to the other individuals in the population for them to be able to survive and reproduce. And so that leads us to the bottom right picture, showing you kind of what evolution is and what it isn't. So you look on the very right of the picture, you go from X, Y, Z. That is not evolution. Evolution does not happen that way. It takes a long period of time, and a lot of things have to happen in order to be able to pass down those traits. So if you look in A, and then you go to generation B, there are some traits that weren't advantageous, that weren't able to help them survive, so they died. And so if you die, you can't pass down those traits. So then you go to C generation and D generation, and all of a sudden something happened in the environment, and those traits in D generation weren't able to survive and reproduce, and so they can't pass down those traits. And so the longer those generations change, because of the best advantageous trait at that time will be the ones that pass down, and that's how the species change. So you see you have a lighter circles in A. Over time, the population turned into dark circles. All right, so let's talk about this idea of what natural selection is. Evolution by natural selection is what we're going to really be focusing on in this unit. And so what is natural selection? Well, first of all, natural selection is how a population of organisms change over time. And so we say that an organism that is best fit to the environment will survive and reproduce. Well, what does fit mean? Let's define the word fit or fitness, the lower left box in your natural selection. Fit or fitness is referring to reproductive fitness. So what we're trying to say is that it's not the strongest, it's not the fastest, it's not the biggest, it's not the smartest. It's just if they have the most fit traits to survive and reproduce viable offspring, then they are considered the best fit. So they have to be able to not only survive, but they also have to be able to reproduce more offspring. So you can see how natural selection works. You have like 3 variations, and then maybe a mutation happened and it caused them to be a little darker, and the environment is in favor of it being darker as a trait, and so the lighter ones are not best fit, so they're beginning to die off. If you die off, you cannot pass down those traits, and so you begin to see a darker population. All right, so how does this occur? So how does natural selection occur? Now we're on the top left. Well, first of all, when we study evolution, we are studying a population of organisms, not an individual. Individuals do not evolve. The whole population over time evolves. So what's population? Remember, it's the same group of organisms that live in a certain area together. So that was just some review from our beginning of the year. But remember, populations have variations in their traits. So all the different individuals that live in the population, they vary because of their variety of different genes and how those genes are expressed. So let's talk about a variation. Variation means it is how the individuals in a population are different from each other. So we're not all the same. We all have different hair colors and eye colors, and we have different heights and different intelligences. And so if you look over here with these Japanese beetles, they have different variations. Some are oranger, some are red, some have big spots, some have no spots, some have one spot. They all have different variations. And sometimes a new variation arises in the population, and that's mostly because of a mutation. And once the mutation maybe is able to be passed down, then maybe that mutation can exist more frequently in the population, and then that's how an individual maybe could increase its fitness and then be able to survive and reproduce and change the population that way. So let's talk about what is an adaptation. An adaptation is in any variation that makes the organism best suited for the environment. And so the adaptation could be a color, a shape, behavior, the chemical makeup of the organism. So if the organism is not well adapted to the environment, it may die. So if the color of their outside body doesn't really make them fit in the environment, they're not camouflaged well, or they can't find enough space to blend in, then they're going to die, and then they can't be able to reproduce and increase that variation. So here's some just examples of some adaptations. Here's a snapping turtle. It has a tongue that looks like a worm. Turtles are very slow, so what it does is it sticks its tongue out and acts like a worm so that something can come towards it and then grab that tongue or worm, and then it's able to grab it and eat it. Same thing with anglerfish with the little light, like from Finding Nemo. That light is very attractive to fish, and that's what helps bring fish to them. There's all a bunch of different varieties of adaptations. There are insects that look like other organisms, like this moth looks like an owl. This spider looks just like the flower. This leaf bug looks just like the leaf. Zebras have stripes, and when they stand next to each other, they look like one giant organism. Tigers blend in with their environment. So there's a bunch of adaptations to be able to help those individuals survive and reproduce. All right, So now that we have defined evolution and natural selection, I want us to turn into our packet to page 6 and really kind of talk about this idea of natural selection and how does it work. So first of all, I want you to get the difference between inherited versus acquired. So inherited are traits that are passed down. It's in our genes. And that is what natural selection acts on. It acts on inherited traits. Acquired trait, that word acquired has nothing to do with evolution. And we don't like that word. Not a good word. Because acquired is something that you can get in your lifetime. It's not genetic. It's not passed down. So you cannot see natural selection occur on acquired traits. When you are born, your ears aren't pierced. But then you might pierce your ears. That is an acquired trait. When you are born, it's not like you automatically can play the guitar. You have to practice and learn how to play the guitar. That is an acquired trait. Inheritable traits is what we're going to be focusing on with natural selection. All right, so looking at this picture, 1, 2, or 3, which one represents a population? Well, you should have said number 2. Number 2 is a population. 3 is actually a community. And which one does natural selection act on? It acts on populations, okay? Remember, populations are what can change over time. Not an individual and not a community, a population. So let's remember when we said back in the definition of evolution, we said descent with modification. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, each species has evolved from a commonality, from a common ancestor. So natural selection is causing evolution from a common ancestor. And so this kind of explains how much diverse of species there exist, how many different varieties of dogs there are versus varieties of finches and birds and insects, and all these different varieties of species exist because there was some commonality where they have descended from. So we're going to talk about the 4 postulates of natural selection. Postulate means rules. What are the 4 rules? So the first rule is that individuals vary in their traits in a population. So remember, genetic variation refers to heritable differences, not acquired. Heritable traits that can be passed down from generation to generation. And so some offer a better reproductive advantage than others, okay? And so natural selection will act on those traits, and they act on phenotype, okay? The second rule or postulate is that traits must be inheritable for natural selection to work. They're inherited. You pass them down. And so every organism will inherit its own unique combination of traits based off of genetics, which we learned about in meiosis, and crossing over in which traits do you actually get. Okay, and so variations in DNA is what leads to inheriting those different traits. You have variations from the different sperm and egg and from crossing over so that you can get the different traits that you might have versus your siblings or cousins and things like that. The third rule is more offspring are produced than can survive. In animal kingdom, there and all sorts of organisms and babies are born, and it's because not all will survive, unfortunately. And so the fourth rule is that those advantageous traits are the ones that will likely survive and reproduce. The ones that can, it's these sea turtles, the ones that can get to the ocean. They have a lot of fighting to do to get into the sea, and then they actually have to be able to find food to live into the sea and be able to survive and to be able to then grow up and then be able to reproduce after that. So those are the 4 rules of or postulates of natural selection, and we'll come back and review this when we come back to class.